Hello there, so the idea of mappers copying other mappers fascinates me. Maybe it's just another sign that I'm going crazy staring at circles and sliders every day, but nonetheless, discovering the different pieces that connect maps and mappers together is something I find obsessively interesting. Just 2 weeks ago, I talked about how this mapper copied this mapper to evoke feelings of nostalgia in his map, and while researching that, I began to think more and more about this sort of mapper copying phenomenon that's spread throughout Osu. First off, I'm not referring to the common sentiment that all mapping is now unoriginal and mappers need to be more creative. That's a completely different topic. I'm instead referring to the abundance of mappers who make maps that are inspired by other maps. Like specific maps. Mappers who take ideas from another map, then implement them into their own, like Evil Twilight did for Lesja earlier. There's more people doing this than you'd think, and it's especially common among more experienced mappers. As I've already said, this stuff tickles my fancy, and so I've gradually started noticing some trends within inspiration-based mapping and possible reasons why it's so popular, which might be worth exploring. There's two main ways I see mappers copy other mappers. One, they replicate a specific concept or a few concepts within a map that stand out, or two, they replicate everything about a map's general style. Copying with either method in mind leads to vastly different results, which I think are exemplified best in one map and a few others associated with it. Apple Eater X's rendition of this Ito Kashitaro song. Or maybe it would be better to start off with Apple's mapping in general. His maps may not be the most iconic, but I find them interesting regardless. In each of his maps, there's always a clear through line of how he habitually organizes objects and player movement. Lots of his maps share the same patterns, which is supported by how he always connects objects with one level of spacing, tons of 90-degree rotations, and symmetrical flipping. It's not easy to put patterns like this or this into words, but by looking at so many of his maps, I'm now able to see what makes up Apple's mapping style, and therefore able to recognize any of his maps based on the general way they're designed. That isn't to say all his maps are the same though. There's more to the way he maps than just his habitual choices, which is what I want to focus on here, on Sayonara Dake ga Jinsei da. The majority of this map could be likened to any of Apple's other maps. That through line is still present. It's got the same basic visual spacing and patterning as most of his other maps, but it's also got a few variations that break from the mold. Some are subtle and nearly insignificant in the bigger picture. Like there's a couple patterns you don't usually see in Apple's maps and there's stacks underneath a lot of slider ends, yet these aren't so different from his usual object composition that they stand out much. The more impactful variations are those that highly deviate from Apple's normal mapping. To make some special parts of the song stand out, Apple uses directly overlapping slider bodies. Major deviation in mapping to express a major difference in the song is fairly standard procedure, but there's a specific reason Apple chose to do so in this way, which I'll explain soon. The variation that stands out most in this map is the way Apple handles consecutive jumps, these two object combos. While most people associate patterns like this with big PP gains, that's not at all relevant on this map, both because it's not difficult enough to reward much PP and because all consecutive jumps are arranged in the least rewarding way possible. Just about every map uses sharp angles between these jumps because they're the most theoretically comfortable to play. However, this map by Apple intentionally uses uncomfortable, wide angles between each grouping. That's both uncommon for mapping in general and relative to Apple's regular type of object composition, so when it's repeated so frequently, it seems like the highlight of the map. Why does knowing any of that matter though? We were just talking about copying other mappers, so you might have already guessed. This map is replicating another mapper, Suraimu Su, and his map of the same song. This map has problems, let's put it that way. Rhythm makes no sense half the time, and it has extremely poor representation of different levels of the song's intensity through spacing and slider velocity. This map would never get ranked without major changes. However, it does have some features Apple may have found interesting. It includes tons of stacks beneath slider ends, it uses directly overlapping slider bodies once, and during the chorus, it repeatedly handles jump groupings in this unconventional way. Familiar by now, right? Essentially, Apple chose the first method of copying. To him, these were the map's most standout ideas, and so he carried them over to his map of the same song. The result was what I already described, a map with objects arranged in Apple's general style, plus a few variations from that style, the highlights, which were directly inspired by Suraimu. So what's the benefit of copying a map like this? Why didn't Apple just map with his ordinary mapping style to begin with? Speaking from personal experience, I think getting too comfortable with one specific style can be a mapper's downfall. Even if the final products are good, it gets boring to repeatedly map in the same way, so taking on new influences as Apple has done here is a way to prevent that boredom. Instead of mindlessly following the music, he can engage himself in mapping by focusing on a few basic concepts alongside what he finds natural. This engagement, I think, makes mapping more fun. So this way of copying is what I see most often, and I consider that a good sign. It shows that mappers are trying to improve by taking a step outside their mapping comfort zones. Only a step though. This first way is what I consider the easier way of copying maps. What's harder to pull off is that second way, replicating a map's general style. Everything about a map, from its highlights to the way literally every single object is associated with one another, has to be accounted for when copying in this way. A mapper needs to forget about their comfort zone and adopt someone else's. They need to understand not only how a different mapper makes their patterns, but what patterns a different mapper would make in any given situation. Copying maps like this can be a major struggle, so it's not as common as the other way, yet I've been seeing it more and more lately, and I think Milan's map of Hanatan's Glow shows how it can effectively be done. Or again, maybe I should talk about Milan's mapping in general first. Milan is the kind of mapper who doesn't have a through line between all his maps. At one point he may have, but over time he's branched out so far that he's no longer really connected to the same roots. All his maps now are clearly distinct from one another, not just through the concepts he uses to highlight each map, but also through each map's general object composition. I won't beat around the bush this time. Glow is copying the map by Apple Eater X we just spent the last few minutes talking about. It's a copy of a map that's copying another map, yes, though the result of that copying is clearly different because of the ways each mapper went about it. Milan carried over those same standout elements that Apple carried over from Saraimu's map, the repeated stacks beneath slider ends and the widely angled 1-2 jumps. We don't need to go over those again. In addition to that though, Milan also carried over Apple's mapping style might be the best way to put it. He's included the basic patterns that can be found in just about all of Apple's maps. The way he connects objects with the one level of spacing, tons of 90-degree rotations, and symmetrical flipping, plus the countless other types of patterns that I can't properly describe with words. You can see what I mean though from these specific examples in each map, and even from the two maps played side by side. Milan replicated Apple's map in every way he could, leaving out his own personal mapping preferences entirely. To a lot of people, that kind of copying might sound bad. I'm describing it like mapping with no soul, like mapping plagiarism. I want to make it clear though, that's not at all what this is. To copy Apple's map, Milan didn't literally copy and paste Apple's objects and say, "Yep, I made this." He painstakingly designed his map by thinking, how would Apple place this circle? How would Apple design this slider? Does this object fit here because I consider this good mapping, or because Apple would consider this good mapping? And all the while, he referenced Apple's Ito Kashitaro map to find the answers. This isn't plagiarism, this is a careful tribute to a map and mapper Milan has analyzed to the core. So what benefit does this have? While that first way of copying is a step out of a mapper's comfort zone, copying like this is abandoning a mapper's comfort zone completely, which is probably the best thing a mapper can do in my opinion. By recreating someone else's habits for a full map, a mapper ingrains a new set of mapping ideas into their mind. In this case, everything about Apple's mapping style and the few concepts this map utilized have become a part of Milan's arsenal of mapping techniques. Milan is a mapper who has no discernible mapping style because after copying so many mappers, he can map in any way he wants with competency. He's not held down by his own mapping preferences because he has no idealized best way of mapping, and therefore he creates every map with different planned out concepts controlling both the highlights of a map and its general composition. So yeah, this map by Apple is cool because it copies specific concepts from a map, whereas this map by Milan is cool because it copies an entire map. By creating these, both mappers were able to expand their ways of mapping by working outside of what they're fully familiar with, which can affect how they design future maps. And I think for experienced mappers especially, that's a big reason why copying like this is so prevalent. How do you get better at mapping? By learning from others. Usually that equates to modding or outside feedback in some way, but that doesn't always work. There's more people looking for help than there are people willing to help, so it often feels like progress is impossible. More importantly though, feedback isn't going to be helpful forever. For new mappers, yeah, mods are great. They get you on the right track. But once you're on that track and you've been writing for a while, modders can't help that much anymore. How do you get better at mapping from here? well, I'd say the same thing, by learning from others, just in a different way. Understanding how others map can be just as beneficial as mods, so long as you know how to do it. Studying maps by playing them or looking at them in the editor can be insightful, but it's not too engaging, so it's hard to really take in the information. I instead find it much easier to improve and learn how someone maps by trying to actively replicate them. Regardless of whether someone is an experienced mapper or a new mapper even, attempting to copy maps in either of these ways allows mappers to understand stuff that feedback from others could never explain. The quirks all mappers have that are subconscious, and stuff that's too subjective to mention in mods, even if they would improve someone's mapping. Copying maps can make mapping engaging because it's a clear path to understanding new mapping ideas, which is a part of why I think it's become so common on Osu. Mappers are always looking to improve because that's part of what makes mapping fun, and copying others is a straightforward way to do that. At least, that's how I feel when I take inspiration from mappers, but I think it could apply to others too. Anyway, this whole copying aspect of mapping is cool, and maybe you understand a bit of why I think so now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.